van, along with her sister, who was standing beside her now. He had been staring at them silently since they were brought in, and neither of the sisters could bring themselves to say anything to him. Tiana peeked at him for the umpteenth time. He had a dark aura around him, which breathed fear, but that only accentuated his sinful beauty. He looked like he had just walked out of a painting. From what her father had described of him, Tiana didn't imagine that he would be this young. "Your father is dead." His voice kicked her out of her thoughts. Her gaze fluttered and she swallowed nervously as her eyes traced his hand that drummed on the table slowly. "Do you know what he did?" he asked, adjusting his position on the chair, supporting his head with his hand as he stared at them intently. Her father had worked for this man before he died. She didn't know what exactly happened, but her father owed him money, which he had squandered on gambling. Now he was dead, leaving the both of them to his accrued debts. Tiana bit her lower lip. "We're trying hard to pay back the money. Please give us more time," she spoke for the first time since they had entered the room. "I never said anything about being patient." His voice was malevolent as he stared at them wickedly. Tiana took in a sharp breath. This man owned a multi-billion-dollar company. Surely what her father owed him meant nothing to him. We don't have the money now," she whispered, looking at him with pain in her eyes. How did he want them to get that amount when he knew they didn't have it? Was he that cruel? Nicholas stared at the woman in front of him, and the only feeling coursing through him was anger. He gritted his teeth as he tried to appear calm. He could have forgiven anything, but not that. No, that man betrayed him to his enemies, and that was unforgivable. They would surely pay for what he had done. "Then you'll have to pay for it in some other way," he told them. Tiana felt Gwen's eyes turn to her, fear flashing through them. How were they going to repay him? Gwen's hand shook on her sides as she turned to look at him. He stared at them quietly, letting them drown in the fear of what was going to befall them. After what seemed like an hour, he spoke. "One of you would have to stay here with me as my mistress." Tiana's mouth fell open and she gazed at him with shock. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Was he really this heartless? He wanted one of them to be a mistress for just a sum of money, when he obviously had 100 times more than that? How could someone be this cruel? "We'll pay back the money, please. We just need time. I promise," Tiana implored. "If you can pay me now, then that's fine. But if you can't, then one of you should prepare to be my mistress for 5 months, he replied half-heartedly, unfazed by the pain on their faces. Gwen turned to her sister in fear. She didn't want to stay with him. Anyone who was capable of doing this was a beast in the flesh. She pursed her lips as she imagined the hell that would befall her if he chose her. Tiana's head fell as tears gathered in her eyes. She didn't know what her father did for this man to be this wicked towards them. Maybe he just lacked humanity. She raised her eyes to him as she swallowed bitterly. "Whom do you choose?" Those were the only words that could leave her lips at the moment, although she somehow already knew the response. They didn't have $10,000, and there was no one to run to for help. They were orphans. Their mother died when she was 5 and Gwen was 4, and since then, they had only their father who had done a few menial jobs to send them to school. It was a few years ago that he began working for Nicholas, and he had slumped to his death after a recent gambling misfortune. Now, his children inherited several huge debts, including this one. She blinked the tears away, trying to pull herself together. The last thing she wanted to do now was to cry. She didn't want to give this man the satisfaction of seeing her in pain. Nicholas stared at the duo in front of him. They looked the same age, but one seemed stronger. A smirk slanted his lips as he shifted his gaze to the frail-looking one. "I want her." Tiana's eyes widened as he traced the man's gaze to her sister Gwen. Just that moment, Gwen fell to her knees trembling. She was done for. Her dreams, her life, was this the end? She was going to spend 5 months with a man who she wasn't sure would let her live. 5 months with a total stranger. 5 months of living in hell with no escape. No, she couldn't do it. Why didn't he choose Tiana? She was standing right here. She was the stronger of them, so why didn't he choose her? Gwen turned to Tiana with tears glistening in her eyes. Tiana, please. I don't want to stay with him. Please. Help me, she begged as her tears streamed down her face. Tiana was the stronger of them both. If anyone had to go, it should be her. Tiana listened to her sister's cries. She couldn't let her sister do this. She was the elder one and needed to protect her. Please, take me instead. Her head fell as she pleaded, closing her eyes. Nicholas scoffed. I sure wasn't stammering when I chose her. Tiana continued to implore him. Please, I beg you, take me instead. I'll do anything you want, just let my sister go, please. Pain clouded her heart, but she knew that she would do anything to protect her sister. Nicholas watched them for a moment and finally said, You can only save your sister on one condition. Tiana raised her head and her eyes stared at him with a mix of pain and hope. No matter what happens, you will not die in these 5 months. If you give up or you die, or you go against our agreement in any way, I'll have no choice but to take your sister too. Tiana blinked painfully. She stared at the man who had a smile of contentment on his lips and wondered how one's pain would give him such joy. But those were his terms. Even though she knew she was walking into a nightmare, she couldn't help it. I accept your terms. The next minute she was being dragged away by 2 hefty men. Tiana turned her head and glanced at her sister. Gwen was standing at the door with tears pouring from her eyes. She wanted to run after her, but she was stopped by a deadly-looking man who hauled her away and closed the door between them. Tiana swallowed hard, trying not to cry again for something she couldn't change. She continued walking forward, her feet screeching across the marble floor. The 2 men led her down the hallway into a room on the right. She was pushed inside and fell on her face. When she heard the ringing of keys behind the closed door, she knew that she had been locked in. Tiana opened her eyes and she realized that the room was dark. Pitch dark. She couldn't even see her white hands. It was painful keeping her eyes open in such darkness, so she had to shut them and curled herself into a ball on the floor. Life was miserable so far. She was just 22 and everything, her dreams, ambitions, joy, hope, everything had been ripped away in the blink of an eye. If one had the right to decide one's fate, she would have chosen to never have been born. The tears she had struggled so hard to keep in rolled down her cheeks. The air in the room was so stuffy and she was sweating all over, but none of it mattered at that moment. She wished it could all end quickly, but sadly her journey had just started. She didn't know for how long she lay there, eyes shut and mind wandering. Because of the darkness, she was sensitive to every sound. She could hear the stomping of feet on the floor above her, the creeping of insects around the dark room, and the never-ending pumping of blood by her shattered heart until she drifted off to sleep. She woke up to the ringing of keys on the door. She sat upright, waiting for the door to open. When it did, the light from the hallway illuminated a patch of the room. She didn't have enough time to look at the person who had opened the door, because as soon as a bowl of food was pushed in, the door slammed shut again. Tiana sat still, listening to the retreating footsteps. She could not move. She had had nothing to eat since morning, but the last thing on her mind was food, so she didn't touch a bit of it. And that was her routine for 2 days straight. Crying, sleeping, and thinking. 3 times a day, the door would open and a meal would be pushed in, but she touched none of them. By the 3rd day, she was already too weak. Her fingers barely moved and her eyes remained shut for almost 3 days. Fresh tears replaced the dried streaks. She could hear the singing of the birds and she knew it was morning. Then, suddenly, the lights in the room turned on. She had not seen such brightness for 3 days. Thus, it was so illuminating that she raised her hands weakly over her eyes. The doors to the room opened and she heard people walk in. Forcing herself to sit up straight, she glanced at them. There was an older woman in her 50s and 2 ladies with her. The older lady watched her for a moment, then she waved to the other 2 and they walked forward and lifted Tiana up. Without waiting for her to stabilize her feet, they dragged her along. Tiana didn't resist them. She didn't even have the strength to. Her feet scraped the floor as they pulled her limp body forward. She heard a door pull open and was dragged inside. The sweet scent of strawberry wafted into her nostrils, and she opened her eyes to see where she was. There was a bath, filled with water. Steam was coming out of it. There was a maid standing beside it, as though she had been waiting for her. "Strip," the old lady commanded. Tiana looked at her and noticed her gaze was firm. There was not a hint of a smile on her face, and she knew that if she didn't strip, she would be forced to. She had not been naked in front of so many people before, and the way they watched her made her nervous. Before she could raise her hands to her clothes, the old lady, running out of patience, instructed the maids with a slight movement of her head. Quickly, the two maids who had dragged her in tore her clothes off her body. One by one they fell, till she was left with nothing but bare skin. Tiana looked down at her body. She hadn't washed for 3 days, and after being locked up for so long, she stank. As though they had already been prepped on what to do, a maid brought a stool and made her sit. Another came with a toothbrush and paste. "Open your mouth," the old lady instructed. Tiana's mouth opened immediately, and the maid brushed it. She was so thorough that Tiana felt blood seeping from her gums. She was still rinsing her mouth when a maid brought 2 little stools and placed them in front of her. Her brows creased as she wondered what they were for. "Place your legs on top of them," the elderly woman's voice rang in the room again, and she did as she was told. Her hands reflexively moved to cover her private part. The old lady, seeing this, walked to her and gave her a resounding slap. "You do as you are told, young lady." Tiana could swear that she saw stars and could hear distant echoes in her right ear where the slap had landed. She blinked several times, trying to hold in the brewing tears. No one needed to tell her to remove her hands. After they were done shaving her entire body, the old lady pointed to the bath and the maids helped her stand up. The bath water was hot when she immersed herself. It smelled nice, like strawberry with a hint of lemon. She soaked in the bath for about 20 minutes, after which the old lady pointed to the shower. Tiana was helped up to the shower and a maid washed her body thoroughly. After her shower, she was dressed in a beautiful cotton dress with her hair and makeup done. When her eyes met the reflection in the mirror, she felt her heart squeeze. She was a beautiful woman, and all her life she had caused heads to turn, but all that did not matter now. Did it? If she could decide her fate, she would have chosen to be a measly beggar sitting by the roadside, rather than Niklas's mistress. Afterward, she was taken to a dining room where assorted food was placed. A seat was pushed out for her, and she sat down. The old lady sat on the opposite side of the table and watched her while the maids served her food. Tiana was famished, and she knew that if she wanted to live for the 5 months and save her sister, she had to eat. So without grudging, she picked up a fork and ate till she was full. After the table was cleared, she was taken to a room on the first floor and was finally left alone. Tiana heaved a sigh of relief when she heard the door close behind her. She looked around her surroundings. It was an exquisite room, a long curtain covering the floor-to-ceiling glass window on the east. There was a large mirror just beside a couch and a queen-sized bed. The dressing table was filled with varieties of lotions and makeup which had been used that day. She walked to the bed and lay down. Tiana didn't know how long she slept, but she awoke when someone tapped her gently. Her eyes fluttered open and she saw the elderly woman standing with a man who had a white coat on. "How are you, Tiana? I'm here to run some blood samples," he said. When she sat upright, he pierced her skin with a syringe and drew out blood. A few seconds later, he was packing up. Tiana remained calm after they left. Her heart was drumming in her chest. They had taken her out of the darkroom, cleaned her thoroughly, and now they were taking her blood for samples. It could only mean one thing, that she would sleep with the monster soon. The mere thought of that man touching her sent shivers down her spine. When she had agreed to be his mistress, this part did not occur to her.